Video game franchises, more so than movies, are always conceived to be around forever. Of course, managing to maintain a brand's relevancy for potentially decades is no easy feat. Popularity is never unwavering, and more often than not, if a franchise was once successful, it will eventually bounce back, even if it's driven into the ground and killed temporarily by terrible business decisions or bewildering creative left turns. Even though they do often bounce back, it's not easy to bring a series back from the brink, and it usually takes a risky reinvention, something which looks completely ridiculous on paper, veering too far away from what people either liked originally or what's profitable at the moment, to deliver something special that jolts the corpse of a video game series back to the land of the living. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 risky sequels that saved dying video game franchises. Number 10, Resident Evil 7. While I don't personally think that Resident Evil 6 was as bad as people say it was a total disaster for the franchise. It still sold well, but after a critical kicking and an overwhelming backlash from fans, the publisher was forced to scale back and rethink its plans for Resi as a whole. Resident Evil was put on ice then until the start of the next generation, with Capcom keeping their mouths shut as how they were going to carry the franchise forward. All fans had to chew on in the meantime were uninspired to okay spin-offs, with hope for a return to form increasingly extinguished with each new release. But then Resident Evil 7 turned the entire ship around. A concerted effort to reinvent the series just like the fourth game, the sequel simultaneously broke new ground and went back to basics, with a new setting, perspective, tone, and set of characters, all complementing its re-embracement of classic survival horror tropes. Such a drastic change didn't please every fan, of course, but it raised Resi back from the dead. Number 9, Fallout 3. While Fallout fans can be split down the middle, divided into those who prefer the isometric tabletop RPG-orientated earlier games and those who embrace Bethesda's more streamlined first-person shooter revivals, there's no denying that the post-apocalyptic series was 6 feet under before the latter studio took the reins. After a couple unsuccessful attempts to break the mainstream, the original developers went out of business after 2 genre-defining games, leaving the IP to languish for years and a cancelled version of Fallout 3 destined to go down as one of the biggest what-ifs in gaming history. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on what you think of Fallout 4 and 76, Bethesda picked up the franchise, and while it kept the iconography and broad story, the studio completely refitted the game to fit its Elder Scrolls mold. That seemed to work though, and it resulted in one of the highest rated RPGs of all time. They might have driven that momentum into the ground a little recently, but for those few years, with Fallout New Vegas included, the franchise was bigger than it had ever been. Number 8, Mortal Kombat. Like a lot of the franchises on this list, Mortal Kombat eventually buckled under its own weight. The PS2 era was a prolific time for the fighting series, with the developers churning out increasingly larger games every couple years, throwing in features like Conquest Chess and expanding on the already confusing plot to the point where it had become virtually incomprehensible. It all culminated in Armageddon, an ambitious title that was practically bursting at the seams as it struggled to fit in all of the content bloat the devs had amassed over the past couple of sequels into one neat package. The next game was Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, a title which epitomized just how far the series had come from its roots. Following that title, the franchise's publisher went bankrupt, and the IP was picked up by Warner Bros. The future was up in the air, but fortunately, the original developers were picked up as well, and they got to work on righting the wrongs of the prior releases. What they opted for was a hard reset, turning back time in the narrative to go back to basics in an effort to re-embrace the gory 2.5D arcade roots of those original titles. Number 7, Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider, even at its worst, has always been one of the biggest names in the gaming industry. Lara Croft is still synonymous with the medium at large, and that brand recognition meant the franchise could just coast along on name value alone without delivering properly great titles. For every legend, there'd be an Angel of Darkness, and for every anniversary, there'd be an Underworld. There was no real singular event that broke the camel's back, but a general feeling that Lara's time had passed. The industry was entering an era of gritty, modern action games, and Tomb Raider's old-school sensibilities just didn't cut it anymore. Consequently, the franchise was put on ice in 2008, rebooted in 2013 with a far more violent, action-orientated gameplay style and a slightly, ever so slightly less crazy narrative. It was a top-to-bottom revamp which rejuvenated the franchise, and it's just a shame the following sequels didn't live up to the potential it established. Number 6, Wolfenstein The New Order. Though it was once a pioneer of an entire genre, by the time the late 2000s came around, Wolfenstein had been left in the lurch. Failing to properly keep up with the times, the shooter series struggled to maintain an audience's interest more focused on online multiplayer and modern military games. But then, with a new developer at the helm and a new publisher in charge of overseeing the IP, The New Order was put into production. In an attempt to revitalize the franchise without losing its key features, the sequel/reboot jumped ahead in time to an alternate 1960s where the Nazis had won World War II and the resistance was all but finished. It was a genius move, as was the decision to move away from the Nazis' supernatural preoccupations in favor of futuristic tech, allowing the series to breathe in a unique setting that nobody else was occupying at the time. It helped that the combat was tight as well, and that the story managed to do the unthinkable and actually make people care about knucklehead BJ Blazkowicz. Number 5. Prey. Admittedly, the term franchise is being used a little loosely for this entry, as Prey only enjoyed one title before it died a long, drawn-out death. But the IP was very much envisioned as being an ongoing series, with Prey 2 being announced almost immediately after the first release, and was a constant presence until it was cancelled in 2014. RIP. It's one of the most grieved over cancellations of all time, primarily because it was shown off a bunch of times and looked like a huge departure yet huge step up from the wonky original. Bethesda ended up canning it due to alleged worries over quality and eventually rebooted production and handed it off to a new studio, Arcane. What they came up with was a far cry from the bounty hunting focus of the original sequel, but instead a System Shock inspired RPG sim. It was a risky move to aim for a far more niche subgenre, but the decision paid off dividends, and the newly retooled Prey became one of the low-key best releases of 2017. Number 4. Hitman. You don't need me to tell you that the Hitman series has always been a staple of the stealth genre, but just like each one of its peers, IO Interactive series succumbed to the pressure of needing to attract a wider audience. After Blood Money gave fans all of the hardcore assassin goodness they could have hoped for, the next sequel, Absolution, stripped a lot of the player freedom out in favor of a more linear and more action-orientated experience. After this, publisher Square Enix planned on taking IO off of the franchise in favor of a newly formed internal studio, eventually relenting after the former's other projects fell through. In an attempt to save the series, the publisher allegedly mandated that the next game be episodic. That decision both helped and hindered the game. On the one hand, it gave the devs the freedom to create infinitely replayable levels that were exactly what the fans were after, but it also hindered sales. Afterwards, IO and Square split, with the former keeping the IP. A sequel swiftly followed, and while financial problems are still an issue, Hitman in its current form is the best version of itself. Number 3. God of War. Despite being one of Sony's premier franchises during the PS2 and PS3 era, God of War, just like Killzone, looked ripe for the chopping block when the PS4 came around. While still selling well, other franchises had put them to shame, making them feel a little shallow in an era when narrative was king. Consequently, after middling spin-off Ascension released in 2013, the franchise was thought to be complete. Kratos' story had been told, and the developers couldn't possibly top the spectacle established so far. But after taking some time off, Sony and Santa Monica decided on an approach that seemed destined to fail. Transform God of War into a character-centric, story-driven experience. Swapping out the setting, the combat mechanics, and most of the cast, the new sequel/reboot attempted to humanize Kratos. Even with that commitment, many thought there'd be no way that the devs would be able to tell a properly affecting story in this world. But they ended up eating their words when God of War became one of the best-reviewed games of the entire generation. Number 2. Nioh Automata. Nobody really had any idea that the original Nioh would become a franchise. The strange, surreal third-person action game from the mind of acclaimed game director/crazy man Yoko Taro enjoyed a cult fanbase, but a litany of issues stopped it from becoming anything close to a smash hit. Though the director had envisioned the game as the first in a saga, publishers initially rejected any sort of follow-up due to the original's poor sales. Taro kept shopping the idea around though, and unfathomably, Square Enix agreed to publish the game, initially planned to be a farming simulator ripoff for mobile. That was thankfully changed, and while some of the original team returned, acclaimed action studio Platinum Games were brought in as the main developers. That action pedigree combined with Taro's always intoxicating writing style meant that the new project solved pretty much all of the issues that plagued the original, and ended up selling way more than either the developers or the publisher ever could have anticipated, 7 years after the dreams of Nioh being a franchise had all but been extinguished. Number 1. Rainbow Six Siege. Rainbow Six Siege is one of the best games of the entire generation so far, in my opinion. But it came so close to not even happening at all. After popularizing the series in the mainstream with the 2 blockbuster Vegas titles, Ubisoft looked for a way to increase the appeal of the IP even further, where, have we heard that one before, attempting to move away from the tactical roots the games were originally built on in favor of a more straightforward, linear, modern military game. Like every FPS in the late 2000s, Rainbow Six Patriots was an attempt to ape Call of Duty, and while it did look very cinematic and very pretty in screenshots, it didn't feel like Rainbow Six. I know that's overused, but you know what I mean. Ubisoft kept chugging ahead for years with no updates until it canned the project outright in 2014, 6 years after the last game released. The next time we saw the franchise was a couple years later with the multiplayer-orientated Siege. The direction of the new project was a stroke of genius, as while an online-only installment initially seemed a bit like Ubi jumping on the bandwagon, it allowed the series to tap back into the high-stakes tactical gameplay that made it famous in the first place. So that's our list. I know you guys think down in the comments below. Do you appreciate these rejuvenated franchises, or should they have just stuck to what they were originally? Either way, while you're down there, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more list news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.